There are moments in life that arrive without warning, moments that divide a person's existence into before and after. For most people, these moments happen in private, whispered into the ears of loved ones or experienced alone in the quiet darkness of a bedroom. But for Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, this moment would happen in front of 200 uniformed men and women in a military briefing room, under fluorescent lights that hummed with a strange indifference to the explosion that was about to reshape everything they thought they knew about courage, gender, and what it truly means to serve. The question itself was harmless. It was asked the way a commander asks questions in a recruitment drive, the way you might ask about volunteers for a difficult task without expecting anyone to step forward. No one ever does. Everyone in that room on that Tuesday morning in March had reasons not to. They had families, promotions they were climbing toward, posting assignments they preferred. They had fear, the kind that tells you to keep your head down and let someone else be the hero. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most ordinary questions trigger the most extraordinary answers. And sometimes one person's calm decision to raise their hand can change the trajectory of an entire institution. This is the true story of how a combat pilot named Sarah Mitchell challenged everything her military branch believed about women in combat roles, not through protest or legal battles, but through the simple act of doing her job better than anyone thought possible. It is a story about breaking barriers that were never supposed to be broken, about discovering strength in places where no one thought to look for it, and about what happens when an institution is forced to confront its own prejudices. Part 1. The morning everything changed. Sarah Mitchell woke up at 4:47 a.m. that morning, 13 minutes before her alarm was set to go off. She had been doing this for the past 3 weeks, waking up before the alarm, her body conditioned by years of military discipline to prepare for the day before the day officially began. She lay in her small apartment near the base, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, listening to the sound of traffic beginning on the street below. Her golden retriever, Murphy, was sprawled across the foot of her bed, already awake and watching her with those patient eyes that dogs develop when they know their humans are about to leave them for the day. The apartment was sparse and clean, the way military housing always is, stripped of anything unnecessary. A framed photograph on her nightstand showed her in her flight suit, standing in front of an F-16 fighter jet, her helmet tucked under her arm. The desert stretched out behind her. That photograph had been taken 5 years ago, before everything got complicated, before the questions started, before she learned that her accomplishments as a pilot were somehow less important than her gender. Sarah had joined the Air Force at 23 years old, right after completing her degree in aerospace engineering at Virginia Tech. Her father had served, her grandfather had served, and for as long as she could remember, she had known that she would serve too. Flying was not something she chose. Flying was something she had always been. As a child, she built model airplanes in her garage. As a teenager, she spent hours at the local airport, watching planes take off and land, imagining herself in the cockpit. When she turned 17, she went skydiving for the first time, and the moment her parachute opened, she knew she had found her purpose. The Air Force had been different than she expected. It was harder in some ways she anticipated, and harder in ways she never could have predicted. The physical training was brutal, but she had prepared for that. The long hours of study required to master the mathematics and physics of flight were challenging, but she had a gift for it, the kind of natural understanding that made some pilots take years to learn what came to her almost intuitively. What she had not been prepared for was the way some of her fellow pilots looked at her, as though she was occupying a seat that should have belonged to someone else. She had not been prepared for the casual comments about whether women belonged in combat roles, the statistical citations about why men were naturally better suited for high-stress flying, the suggestions that she had gotten her position because of her gender rather than in spite of it. Sarah had learned to ignore these things, or she had learned to pretend to ignore them. She had learned to work harder, to score higher on her evaluations, to fly cleaner sorties than anyone else in her unit. She had learned to smile through the comments and laugh at the jokes and never ever show that any of it bothered her. She had learned that the price of belonging was the constant effort to prove that you belonged. But lately, something had been changing inside her. A small voice, barely audible beneath the noise of military routine and professional ambition, had started asking her questions. It asked her why she was trying so hard to fit into a system that did not want her there. It asked her whether all this effort was worth the cost. It asked her whether she had become so focused on proving them wrong that she had forgotten why she had ever wanted to fly in the first place. At 5 a.m., she rolled out of bed, scratched Murphy behind his ears, and headed for the shower. The shower was a ritual, a moment of solitude where she could prepare herself for the day. The hot water ran over her shoulders, and she let her mind wander to the briefing that had been scheduled for 10 a.m. It was a special recruitment presentation, something about a new program that needed volunteers. She had not paid much attention to the announcement email. She had no intention of volunteering for anything. Her assignment was good, her posting was stable, and she had plans for the next 5 years that did not include complications. She dressed in her flight suit, the fabric crisp and familiar, a second skin that had become more comfortable than her own body. She pinned her hair back in the neat bun that regulations required, checked her appearance in the mirror, and then spent a long moment just looking at herself. The woman in the mirror was 40 years old, though she often felt older. She had circles under her eyes that makeup never quite covered, a tension around her mouth that came from years of clenching her jaw to keep words inside that she was not supposed to say. But her eyes were clear, and her posture was straight, and the insignia on her uniform meant something. It had always meant something to her, even when it meant less to the people around her. She left her apartment at 6:30 a.m., the morning still dark, the base still quiet. She stopped at the coffee shop just inside the gate, ordered her usual black coffee, and nodded at the young enlisted man working the counter who always remembered exactly how she liked it. She drove to the flight line, even though she was not scheduled to fly that day, because this was where she felt most herself. The hangars loomed in the darkness, massive structures that held the most powerful machines she had ever seen. She parked her car and walked between the rows of aircraft, running her hand along the fuselage of a jet as she passed, a small gesture of affection. The briefing room was beginning to fill up when she arrived at 9:45 a.m. It was a large space, built to hold the entire fighter squadron, with rows of seats arranged in an auditorium style facing a raised platform where the commanding officer would stand. Sarah took a seat in the middle, far enough back to be inconspicuous but forward enough to see everything. Around her, pilots and weapons officers and support crew filed in, some reading emails on their phones, some talking in low voices about their morning, some still nursing the exhaustion of early wake-up times. She knew most of these people. There was Captain Derek Henderson, who had made an inappropriate comment about her appearance during a sortie debrief the month before. There was Major Linda Graves, who had been supportive from the beginning and had pulled Sarah aside last year to tell her that she was doing something important just by showing up every day. There was Lieutenant James Crawford, who had barely spoken 10 words to her in the 2 years they had worked together. And there was Sergeant Maria Torres, who brought her coffee sometimes and texted jokes that made her laugh when she needed it most. They were all here because they were good at what they did. They were warriors and guardians and skilled pilots who had dedicated their lives to a mission that was bigger than themselves. And they were all, in their own ways, shaped by the institution they served. Colonel Michael Patterson, the commanding officer, took his place on the platform at exactly 10 a.m. He was in his 50s, with the kind of bearing that came from 30 years of military service. He had not been particularly kind to Sarah, but he had not been explicitly cruel either. He existed in a space of professional neutrality, the way many officers did, pretending not to notice problems they felt uncomfortable addressing. "Thank you all for being here," Colonel Patterson said, his voice carrying easily through the briefing room. "I know you all have other places to be, so I'm going to keep this brief. We have an opportunity, a new assignment, something that's been approved at the highest levels. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is dangerous work. This is the kind of assignment that will test you in ways you haven't been tested before. But it's important work, and we need volunteers." He outlined the details then. Something about a special operations mission. Something classified and sensitive. Something that would require months of training and would offer no guarantee of success. The specifics blurred together in Sarah's mind. She was not particularly interested. She had heard pitches like this before, and she had learned that special assignments usually meant extra pressure without proportional benefit. "So," Colonel Patterson concluded, "is there anyone here who has previous combat flying experience? Specifically, is anyone here a combat pilot?" 200 people, and not a single hand went up. Sarah looked around the room, watching the faces of the people around her, trying to understand why everyone was looking down, why nobody seemed to want to make eye contact with the commanding officer. Then something happened inside her. It was not a decision. Exactly. It was more like a moment of clarity, a sudden understanding of something that had been building inside her for years. She thought about every comment she had ignored, every joke she had laughed at, Every time she had told herself to work harder, try harder, prove herself more thoroughly, she thought about the fact that she had flown 17 combat missions over the past 4 years, more than most pilots in this room. She had incoming fire intelligence on her jacket. She had made split-second decisions under pressure that had meant the difference between going home and going to the memorial wall. She was, by every definition that mattered, a combat pilot. And in that moment, with the room completely silent, with her career hanging in the balance, with every rational part of her mind screaming at her to keep her hand down, Sarah Mitchell slowly raised her arm. Her hand went up in the quiet room like a flag surrendering or a flag rising, depending on your perspective. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then Colonel Patterson's eyes found her, and something like shock flickered across his face. Then every head in the room turned toward her, and she felt the weight of 200 sets of eyes. The collective attention of her entire unit focused on this one moment, this one gesture. She kept her hand raised. She did not flinch. She did not look away. And in that moment, with her hand still in the air, Sarah Mitchell understood that she had just initiated something that could not be undone, something that would echo far beyond this briefing room, something that would force everyone around her to confront questions they had been avoiding for years. Colonel Patterson stared at her for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. Then he nodded slowly, made a note on the paper in front of him, and said, "Thank you. Anyone else?" No one else raised their hand. The briefing continued. But something fundamental had shifted. The air in the room felt different. The light seemed to fall at different angles. And in her seat, in the middle of the room, Sarah Mitchell sat with her hand lowered but her mind racing, beginning to understand the full magnitude of what she had just done. The briefing ended at 10:47 a.m., and Sarah had planned to walk directly back to her office to handle the paperwork that never seemed to end in the Air Force. But before she could make it out of the auditorium, Colonel Patterson called her name. His voice echoing across the emptying room. She felt every eye that remained in the briefing room focus on her again, felt the sudden shift in the air that came from everyone understanding that something unexpected was about to happen. She made her way to the front of the room, where Colonel Patterson stood with a folder in his hands and an expression that was difficult to read. He was not smiling, but he was not frowning either. His face had settled into that professional neutrality that officers perfected over years of practice, the mask that kept their true feelings safely hidden away. "Mitchell," he said, keeping his voice low enough that the remaining people in the room could not hear him clearly, though she suspected they were trying. "I need to be very honest with you about what you just volunteered for. This is not a joke. This is not something you can change your mind about in a week. Once you're in, you're committed to a minimum of 18 months. She had understood that much from the briefing, though Colonel Patterson had been sparse on details. That was typical for classified operations. You volunteered first, asked questions later, and if you could not accept the lack of information, you got out while you still could. I also need to be honest about the fact that there are people, senior people, very senior people, who are not going to be happy about this," Colonel Patterson continued. He shifted his weight slightly, and Sarah noticed that his jaw had tightened. This was personal for him, she realized. He was uncomfortable. "There are opinions about women in combat roles. I suspect you already know that." "Yes, sir," Sarah said. She kept her voice level, professional, empty of the complicated feelings that were swirling inside her chest. "Some of those opinions come from good places," Colonel Patterson said, and Sarah could hear the careful choice of his words, the way he was trying to be diplomatic about something that had never required diplomacy before. "Some people genuinely believe they're protecting you. Some people genuinely believe that women are not suited for the psychological demands of sustained combat operations. Some people have data, or they think they have data, about the differences in how male and female pilots perform under extreme stress." He paused, and Sarah waited. She had learned long ago that the most important things were often said in the spaces between words. "The truth is," Colonel Patterson said finally, "I don't know if those opinions are right or wrong. I don't know if you're capable of what this mission is going to ask of you. But I know that you are one of the most skilled pilots I have ever seen in my 30 years of service. I know that your performance metrics are excellent, and I know that you have combat experience. So I'm going to give you this opportunity, and I'm going to hope that you succeed, because if you do, it might change some minds around here." There was something almost sad in the way he said it, as though he understood that he was handing her not just an assignment but a burden, the weight of representing something larger than herself. the responsibility of proving something that should not have needed proving. "I'll do my best, sir," Sarah said. "I know you will," Colonel Patterson replied. "The question is whether your best is going to be good enough." The first week after the briefing was strange. Sarah was not supposed to tell anyone about the assignment, but somehow everyone knew. Information traveled through the military base like electricity through copper wire, fast and efficient and unstoppable. She caught people looking at her differently. Some looked at her with something that might have been respect, others with something that looked more like resentment, as though by raising her hand she had somehow insulted them personally. She continued her normal duties, flying her scheduled sorties, attending her regular briefings, maintaining the professional distance that she had cultivated so carefully over the years. But everything felt different now. When she was in the ready room, the conversation sometimes stopped. When she walked into the dining facility, she was aware of the conversations that followed her progress through the line. When she attended meetings, she could feel the undercurrent of something unspoken, something that hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. 2 days after the briefing, Major Linda Graves pulled her aside in the hallway outside the operations center. "I heard about your volunteer," Major Graves said. She was smaller than Sarah, more delicate in build, but she had a presence that made her seem larger. She had become a mentor to Sarah over the past few years, one of the few senior officers who had been openly supportive of women in combat roles. "News travels fast," Sarah said. "It does in a military base," Major Graves replied. "How are you feeling about it?" Sarah considered the question. It was the kind of question that most people asked rhetorically, not expecting a real answer. But Major Graves had a way of asking questions like she actually wanted to know, like your answer mattered to her. "I don't know yet," Sarah said honestly. "Part of me is terrified. Part of me is angry that I had to raise my hand to get an opportunity that should have been available to me all along. And part of me is excited because this is what I've been working toward for my entire career." "Those are all legitimate feelings," Major Graves said. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be better than the men around you. You just have to be good enough. And Mitchell, you are good enough. You have always been good enough." She wanted to believe that being good enough was sufficient, but she knew from years of experience that for women in the military, good enough was never actually good enough. There was always one more standard to meet, one more thing to prove, one more invisible bar that kept getting raised higher. The following week, Sarah was officially brought into the briefing room that had been set up in a separate secure facility. The project was called Operation Nighthawk, and it was classified at the highest levels. She signed documents that promised imprisonment if she discussed it with anyone not cleared for the information. She read files that detailed a planned operation in a region of the world where the military's presence was officially non-existent, where flying combat missions was technically not something the Air Force was supposed to be doing. The lead officer on the project was a man named General Richard Brooks, a senior officer with a reputation for getting results and a history of being difficult to work with. He was in his late 50s, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of stone, and he looked at Sarah the way someone might look at an unexpected guest at their dinner party, with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "So you're the volunteer," General Brooks said. It was not a question, and it did not require an answer. "Yes, sir," Sarah said anyway. "Colonel Patterson says you're skilled," General Brooks continued. "Says you have combat experience. Says you understand what you're getting into." I do, sir," Sarah said. "Do you?" General Brooks leaned back in his chair. He was not hostile exactly, but he was not welcoming either. He was professionally distant in a way that suggested his mind was already made up about something, and he was waiting for Sarah to prove him right. "This operation is going to be harder than anything you've experienced before. The weather will be worse. The intelligence will be less reliable. The enemy will be better equipped and better trained than anything you've faced. And you'll be doing all of it knowing that officially you're not supposed to be there. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "And that doesn't scare you?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah understood that this was a test, that General Brooks was waiting to see if she would be honest or if she would maintain the pretense that military personnel were supposed to maintain. The fiction that fear was something you overcame rather than something you acknowledged. "It terrifies me, sir," Sarah said, "but I can do it anyway." General Brooks studied her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "All right then," he said. "You start training Monday. I'm assigning you to work with Captain Henderson." Sarah's stomach sank. Captain Derek Henderson was one of the best pilots in the squadron, but he was also one of the most openly skeptical about women in combat roles. He had made comments about Sarah's flying ability, subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but pointed enough that everyone knew what he meant. He was the worst possible person to pair her with for this training, and Sarah suspected that was exactly why General Brooks had done it. As she was leaving the briefing, General Brooks called her back. "Mitchell," he said, "I want you to understand something. I don't care if you're a man or a woman. I don't care about any of that. I care about whether you can fly, whether you can think, and whether you can follow orders. Can you do those three things?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "Then you have a chance. Whether you take it or not is up to you." The training began on a cold Monday morning in April. Sarah met Captain Henderson at the flight line, and he looked at her with an expression of barely concealed irritation. "I don't know what you think you're getting yourself into," he said without preamble, "but I want to be clear about something. You're going to be flying some of the most dangerous sorties we have in our arsenal. You're going to be doing it in an environment where mistakes get people killed. And I'm going to be watching you very carefully to make sure that you don't fuck up and get anyone else killed in the process." She had expected this. She had known that this partnership was going to be difficult. "I understand, sir," she said. "I'm ready to work." "We'll see about that," Henderson said. For the next 4 months, Sarah and Captain Henderson flew together, sometimes for 6 hours a day, sometimes more. They practiced emergency procedures until Sarah could execute them in her sleep. They ran combat simulations so many times that she could predict what the enemy would do 3 moves before they did it. They studied tactics and strategy and the specific challenges of flying in the region where Operation Nighthawk was scheduled to take place. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed between Sarah and Captain Henderson. It was not friendship. It was not even exactly respect, but it was something like professional acknowledgement, a recognition that they were both good at what they did and that their job was to work together, not against each other. One day, about 3 months into the training, Henderson did something unexpected. He was debriefing Sarah after a particularly difficult simulation, and instead of criticizing her performance, he said, "You know, when I heard you volunteered for this, I thought you were making a mistake. I thought you were going to embarrass yourself and everyone else on this team." Sarah waited. She had learned that Henderson was the type who said things in layers, and you had to wait for all the layers to be revealed. "I was wrong," he continued. "You're going to be fine, better than fine. You're going to be one of the best pilots on this operation. And I'm going to feel like shit if anything happens to you out there, because I spent 3 months waiting for you to prove me right, when you spent 3 months proving me wrong." Sarah did not know how to respond to that. She had learned to accept criticism and to ignore praise, but she did not know how to respond to someone admitting that they had been wrong, that they had misjudged her, that they had allowed their assumptions to color their perception. "Thank you, sir," she said finally. "Don't thank me yet," Henderson replied. "We still have to go out there and actually do this thing. And when we do, I'm going to be watching you, and I'm going to be terrified, and I'm going to be hoping that every decision you make keeps you alive." "I'll do my best," Sarah said. "I know you will," Henderson said. "The question is whether your best is going to be good enough." It was the same question Colonel Patterson had asked her. It was the question Sarah had been asking herself ever since she raised her hand in that briefing room. And as she looked at Captain Henderson, as she thought about the months of training that lay ahead, as she contemplated the reality of what Operation Nighthawk would actually entail, Sarah Mitchell realized that the question was not going to be answered until the moment when it actually mattered, until she was up in the sky with incoming fire and split-second decisions and everything she had trained for suddenly becoming real. The only thing she could do between now and then was prepare. The only thing she could do was work. The only thing she could do was prove, one day at a time, that she belonged there, that she could do this, that her hand raised in that briefing room had been the right choice, even if she was the only one who believed it. Operation Nighthawk launched on a night in August when the sky was the color of spilled ink and the stars were so bright they hurt to look at. Sarah sat in the pilot's seat of her F-16, waiting for the signal to launch, her heart beating in a steady rhythm that she had learned to control through years of training. Around her, other jets were being prepared for launch, mechanics moving with practiced efficiency, the sounds of the airfield rising and falling like the breathing of some vast mechanical creature. The mission briefing had been clear. They were going to fly into a region of contested airspace where the enemy had radar systems and surface-to-air missiles and fighter jets of their own. They were going to provide air support for ground operations that would be happening simultaneously, and they were going to do it in darkness, with limited visibility, and with rules of engagement that required split-second decision-making under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Sarah had flown combat missions before. She had incoming fire intelligence on her jacket. She had made decisions under pressure that mattered. But this was different. This was Operation Nighthawk, the classified mission that she had volunteered for. The assignment that had made her the center of attention and speculation and doubt. This was the moment where all the training would either pay off or fail spectacularly. She ran through her pre-flight checklist one final time, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The jet responded to her touch the way a musical instrument responds to a musician, each movement producing exactly the result she expected. She was as ready as she could possibly be. The signal came through on the radio, and Sarah advanced the throttle. The F-16 surged forward, pulling her back slightly into the seat as she accelerated down the runway. The landscape blurred past her, and then the wheels left the ground and she was airborne. Flying at night was different from flying during the day. The visual cues that she relied on during daylight operations were gone, and she had to trust her instruments completely. She had to trust the radar that showed her where she was, trust the navigation system that guided her to her destination, trust her own skills and training and the thousands of hours she had spent in a cockpit. The flight to the operational area took 45 minutes. Sarah maintained radio silence as instructed, listening to the voices of the other pilots in her formation, keeping track of their positions through her radar display. Behind her, Captain Henderson flew his own jet, a wingman's position that put him close enough to support her, but far enough away to maintain the separation required by flight operations. When she reached the operational area, the darkness below was absolute. No lights, no cities, nothing but black that went down forever. She had studied maps of this terrain, had memorized landmarks and coordinates and all the information that ground control had provided. But from the air, in darkness, everything looked the same. This was where faith in her instruments became absolute. Ground control came alive in her earpiece, voices giving her target coordinates and updated information about enemy positions. There were surface-to-air missiles in the area, they told her. There might be fighter aircraft. Stay alert, stay sharp, stay alive. Sarah descended toward her first target. The jet screamed down through the darkness, and she heard the electronic warning system alert her to the fact that she was being tracked by radar. Enemy radar. Somewhere below her, someone was watching her approach, someone was calculating the best moment to fire their missile, someone was trying to kill her. She released her ordnance and banked hard to the left, pulling out of the dive before the missiles could reach her. The G-forces slammed her back into the seat, pulling her toward the earth, and she felt the familiar weight pressing down on her chest, the sensation that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. Nighthawk 1, missile launch detected, ground control said, urgency creeping into the calm voice. Multiple contacts, recommend immediate evasion to the northwest. Sarah was already moving, already banking in the direction that ground control had suggested. She pushed the jet speed higher, pulled up through the darkness, and felt the missile pass below her, so close that she swore she could feel the heat of its exhaust. That was the moment when something shifted inside her. That was the moment when all the doubt, all the questions about whether she belonged there, all the voices telling her that she was not good enough, all fell away like leaves falling from a tree in autumn. She was not thinking anymore. She was flying. She was doing the thing she had been born to do, the thing she had trained for, the thing that made her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. For the next 4 hours, Sarah flew in and out of the contested airspace, making bombing runs, evading missiles, supporting ground operations with surgical precision. She did not think about whether she was male or female. She did not think about the doubters or the skeptics or the people who had told her she did not belong. She just flew. When she finally landed back at the secure airfield, her hands were shaking with adrenaline. The ground crew rushed out to help her out of the jet, and she was surprised to find that her legs did not want to support her weight. A medic appeared out of nowhere and was looking in her eyes with a flashlight, asking her questions about how she felt, whether she had any injuries, whether she could walk. Captain Henderson was already down and out of his jet, and when he saw Sarah, he rushed over and grabbed her in a hug that was entirely unprofessional and completely sincere. There were tears on his face, though she did not think he realized it. Jesus Christ, he said into her shoulder. You're okay. You're actually okay. I'm okay, Sarah said, and she realized that she was laughing, that the tension of the mission was releasing itself in something between a laugh and a sob. I'm okay. General Brooks was waiting in the operations center when Sarah walked in for the post-flight debrief. He looked at her with an expression that was almost unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that she recognized. It was respect. It was acknowledgement. It was the look of someone who had been proven right about his decision. Report, he said simply. Sarah went through the details of the mission, the targets she had hit, the obstacles she had encountered, the decisions she had made. She described the missile launch, the evasion, the precision of her flying. She was trying to be clinical about it, to maintain the professional distance that military personnel were supposed to maintain. But her voice kept shaking. When she finished, General Brooks was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do you know how many pilots we have who could have flown that sortie?" Sarah knew she was not supposed to answer, that the question was rhetorical. 217, General Brooks continued. I asked our analyst to calculate it. 217 pilots in the entire operation could have theoretically flown that mission. You know how many actually could have? 14. 14 pilots have the combination of skill and training and judgment required to fly a mission like that. Congratulations, Mitchell. You're one of them. Word spread through the base like wildfire. Sarah Mitchell had flown Operation Nighthawk. Sarah Mitchell had survived. Sarah Mitchell had done something that men and women both had questioned whether she could do. The narrative shifted, not immediately and not completely, but shifted nonetheless. There were still skeptics. There were still people who believed that women did not belong in combat roles, that Sarah's success was an anomaly, that one woman's achievement could not change fundamental truths about gender and capability. But there were also people who had watched her succeed, who had seen her skill firsthand, who could not deny what they had witnessed. Over the following months, Sarah flew more sorties in the Operation Nighthawk theater. She developed a reputation as one of the most skilled pilots in the operation. She was given increasing responsibility, more complex missions, tougher assignments, and she succeeded at all of them. But more importantly, something else happened. Other women started to volunteer. Over the course of the next year, 8 other female pilots requested postings to Operation Nighthawk. Some of them did not work out. Some of them washed out of the program for legitimate reasons that had nothing to do with their gender, but some of them succeeded. And slowly, the institution began to change. A year after Operation Nighthawk launched, Sarah was promoted to Major. 2 years after, she was selected for command track. 3 years after raising her hand in that briefing room, she was given command of her own squadron, becoming one of the highest-ranking female combat pilots in the Air Force. But the moment that mattered most came 2 years after the first Operation Nighthawk mission, when Sarah was asked to speak at a recruitment event for young people interested in joining the Air Force. She stood in front of a room full of high school students, and she looked out at their faces, and she saw some of them looking at her the same way she had looked at pilots when she was their age. She saw them imagining themselves in the cockpit, imagining themselves flying, imagining themselves succeeding at something that people had told them was not possible. A young woman, probably 17 years old, raised her hand during the question and answer portion. Major Mitchell, she said, how did you know that you could do it? How did you know that you could be a combat pilot when everyone was telling you that you probably couldn't? Sarah thought about the briefing room. She thought about the moment when she raised her hand. She thought about the months of training, the operation itself, the missiles and the darkness, and the moment when she realized that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. I didn't know, Sarah said. That's the truth. I didn't know if I could do it. I still didn't know when I was flying that first mission. All I knew was that I wanted to try. I knew that I had trained hard, and I knew that I was skilled. And I knew that I wanted it badly enough to be willing to risk failure. Sometimes that's all the knowing you get. The young woman nodded slowly, taking in the answer, processing it in the way that young people process information from adults they admire. The hardest part wasn't the flying, Sarah continued. The hardest part was believing that I deserved to be there. The hardest part was quiet, internal, and it was completely mine to overcome. No one could do it for me. But the flying part? That was the easy part. That was the part I loved. After the event, Colonel Patterson, now retired, pulled Sarah aside. He was older, grayer than she remembered, but his eyes were still sharp. I never told you this, he said, but when you raised your hand in that briefing room, I was praying you would. I was hoping someone would. I just wasn't sure if it was going to be you. Why? Sarah asked. Because I knew what it would cost, Patterson said. I knew that you would carry the weight of representing something larger than yourself. I knew that you would be held to a different standard. I knew that your success would be studied and analyzed in ways that success by male pilots never was. And I was not sure if it was fair to ask you to bear that weight. But you're glad I did it? Sarah asked. I'm proud of you, Colonel Patterson said, but I also mourn for the fact that you had to do it at all. In a just world, you would have had a choice. You would have had the option to volunteer or not to volunteer, and it would have been a simple career decision, not a referendum on gender and capability. I hope that the world is moving toward being more just. I hope that women after you will have real choices about what they want to do with their careers. I hope that the next woman who volunteers for a combat operation doesn't have to carry the weight of representation. But I'm grateful that you were willing to carry it, at least for a while. Years later, after Sarah had retired from active duty, she would think about that conversation. She would think about the cost of being the first, about the weight of representation, about the responsibility that came with breaking barriers. She would think about the young pilots who came after her, both men and women, and how they had benefited from the doors that she had opened. But most of all, she would think about the moment when she raised her hand in that briefing room. She would remember the silence of the room, the shock on the faces of the people around her, the feeling of doing something that was terrifying and necessary and right all at the same time. She would remember that her calm response to a simple question had done more than answer a question. It had asked other questions. It had challenged assumptions. It had forced people to confront the ways that they had been wrong. It had opened doors that no one had known were locked, and she would remember that it all came down to one moment, one decision, one woman deciding that she belonged there and being willing to prove it, not through words but through action, through flying, through doing the thing that she loved in the way that only she knew how to do it. That was the legacy of Operation Nighthawk, not just the military success of the operation itself, though that had been significant, but the larger success of the institutional change that it catalyzed. The moment when one woman's calm response to a simple question shook an entire unit to its core and forced it to become something better than it had been before. The institution did not change because of policy decisions or legal battles or political pressure. It changed because one woman was good at her job, and she did that job so well that no one could deny her success. It changed because she was willing to accept the challenge even when she was not sure if she could meet it. It changed because she showed, not told, what was possible. And perhaps most importantly, it changed because she was not the only one willing to follow her lead. Once the door was opened, others walked through it. Not all of them succeeded. Not all of them wanted to stay. But enough of them succeeded, enough of them wanted to continue, that the institution was forced to acknowledge its own prejudices and begin, however slowly, however reluctantly, to change. The question that Colonel Patterson had asked that day was simple. Any combat pilots? He had said. 3 words, spoken casually, with no expectation of an answer. But one woman's response to that simple question had consequences that rippled outward, that affected the institution, that changed the trajectory of her own life and the lives of countless others. Sarah Mitchell never asked to be a pioneer. She never asked to carry the weight of representation or to be the symbol of institutional change. She just wanted to fly. She just wanted to do the thing she loved and to be recognized for being good at it. But sometimes, by simply doing what you love and doing it well, you change the world without even meaning to. That was the legacy of Operation Nighthawk. That was the meaning of the moment when Sarah raised her hand in that briefing room. That was the truth hidden inside a simple question and a calm response that would echo through years and decades and maybe even centuries, reminding people that change sometimes comes not from grand gestures, but from quiet, ordinary moments when someone decides to believe in themselves.